Hi, today I'm going to tell you about inter-VLAN routing using a layer 3 switch, because this is of course also an option if you want to route between your different VLANs. So if you add a layer 3 switch instead of using a router, you may be able to route between your different VLANs. It is of course important that you have created your VLANs on the switch, and then you can actually create something called a switch virtual interface for each VLAN. And these switch virtual interface or SVIs are seen as a layer 3 interface, and therefore you can switch or route between the different interfaces. So within this multi-layer switch or layer 3 switch, you will be able to route the traffic internally between the different VLANs. This is a very scalable solution because for each VLAN you just create a switch virtual interface. So when you have a layer 3 switch or a multi-layer switch, well, then you are able to either switch the packages, or you can also route them. You can create on the switch a routed port instead of a switch port, or you can use the SVIs. Most layer 3 switches understand basic routing. You can set up, for instance, static routing. You can probably also set up to use other kinds of routing protocols. So the switch can perform the basic routing functionality. You can also just create the switch virtual interfaces and thereby route traffic between the different VLANs on that behalf. So either your port is or you use switch virtual interfaces, or you use the routing ports on your interfaces, or create a routing port of your interface. And this solution is much faster because routing and multi-layer switching has become much faster over the years, and it's also much cheaper. And you already have your VLANs. Now you just create a virtual interface for each VLAN, and then you can route between them. Yeah, depending on what you else need. If you need some other kind of routing functionality, well then, as I said, you can set up a routed port in your layer 3 switches as well. So by default, you have a SVI called VLAN 1 because it's the default VLAN, and everything belongs to VLAN 1. If you don't do anything, you will have one VLAN, and that's called VLAN 1. The other SVIs you must create yourself, and it is important that you create your VLANs first, and then you create the SVIs after that. And to be able to create an SVI, what you actually do is you go to interface and you say interface VLAN 10. Then you have created a virtual interface for VLAN 10. And then you can give your IP address on the SVI for VLAN 10, and thereby be able to trunk and to send information from one VLAN to another. It also uses the 802.1q protocol, and will be able to see the VLAN tags. And that's it. That's how you create the switch virtual interface. So in this case here, instead of having a routed interface or a router between your two VLAN, in this case VLAN 10 over here and VLAN 20, well then you have here a multi-layer switch or a layer 3 switch, and you have two SVIs, one for each VLAN, and with the correct IP address for that, the subnet that you have decided to use for VLAN 10 and VLAN 20, for instance. And when this is done, you're able to communicate between the different VLANs. So it's much faster to use layer 3 switching than to use a router on a stick setup. good thing also that if you have, for instance, multiple switches that you have connected, you can use either channel, so you can bundle the different connections between the switches as well. You cannot do that if you use router on a stick, for instance, and you have to use the physical connection between the switch and the router. And since all information is going through, the router could become the bottleneck in your network. You will not experience that if you use a layer 3 device instead, a layer 3 switch device instead. And it is also really, really scalable when you're using a multi-layer switch or a layer 3 switch. Yeah. So, you could, of course, also, when you're doing it, if you want to have other routing functionality, because a layer 3 switch can be set up with other types of routing functionality. Well, if you want to create a routed port, you use the command no switch port. Then the layer 3 switch will see the port as being a router interface instead of a switch port. So it will be seen as the interfaces on a router. They depend on the different IOSs that you have, but normally it's quite easy just to set it up with a no switch port command. Yeah, it does not, a routed port on a switch does not support sub interfaces. You should be aware of that. So if you want to communicate between the different VLANs on a layer 3 switch, you should not use a routed port, you should use a SVI. There are different templates for the use of layer 3 switches. If you want to have LAN-based routing, you can implement a template for that, for instance. You can use the command show SDM prefer, so then you can see which templates that you are using. And when you are using the templates, well, then everything is pre-configured to be set up for routing between different interfaces, for instance. Yeah, so what should you be aware of? Well, of course, you need to make sure that the VLANs are defined and set up across your network. If you have multiple switches, you can either use the VTP command to set up the same VLANs on all switches, or you can do it manually. You must, of course, enable the trunk ports, and ports must be in the right VLANs. When you set up the SVIs, they must be up. You do a no shutdown on them as well, and you set it up with the correct IP address and subnet mask. And of course, it must match the VLAN number that you have. If you're using routing on your layer 3 switch, well, then you must set it up to be a routed port. You must also enable routing on your layer 3 switch, and well, you must set it up with the correct IP addresses, and also the host must be configured with the correct gateway associated with either the SVI or the routed port, of course. Yeah, that was it. Thank you.